The autumn wind swept across the rolling Kansas plains, rustling through the tall prairie grass surrounding Catherine Miller's modest homestead on the outskirts of Abilene. At 32, she had carved out a life for herself after her husband's passing, managing their small cattle ranch with quiet determination. The year was 1873, and while other women might have sold the property and moved back east, Catherine found purpose in the challenge of surviving on her own terms. Her weathered hands gripped the worn fence post as she surveyed her land in the fading light. 24 head of cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, their dark shapes moving slowly against the golden horizon. The lonely whistle of a meadowlark carried on the breeze, a sound that had become as familiar to her as her own heartbeat over the past 5 years of solitude. Thomas Wilson, her nearest neighbor 3 miles to the east, had warned her just yesterday about increased tribal movement in the territory. The Pawnee were being pushed north by settlers and other tribes, creating tension that rippled through the region like waves across a pond. Catherine took such warnings seriously, but she refused to live in fear. She had learned to shoot straight and think clearly, skills that had served her well in the unforgiving frontier. Inside her cabin, she stirred a pot of bean soup hanging over the hearth, the rich aroma mingling with wood smoke. The simple meal would sustain her through another evening of mending and planning for the coming winter. A stack of newspapers from back east sat unopened on her rough-hewn table, brought by the monthly supply wagon. They were her tenuous connection to the civilization she'd left behind, though their news seemed increasingly irrelevant to her daily life. The first gunshot shattered the evening calm like a crack of lightning. Catherine's hand instinctively reached for the Winchester rifle mounted above her door. More shots followed, accompanied by the distant thunder of hooves and unfamiliar voices carried on the wind. Moving swiftly to her window, she peered out into the gathering dusk, her heart pounding against her ribs. What she saw made her blood run cold. A small group of riders pursuing a lone figure on horseback. The fleeing rider was clearly injured, slumped forward over their mount's neck. Even in the dim light, Catherine could see it was a woman in native dress, her long black hair streaming behind her as she urged her pony toward the shelter of Catherine's homestead. Without hesitation, Catherine grabbed her rifle and stepped onto her porch. The pursuing riders were closing fast, their whoops and hollers carrying a distinctly cruel edge that told her these were no lawmen in pursuit of a criminal. These were the kind of men who used the chaos of frontier life to prey on the vulnerable, regardless of race or circumstance. The wounded rider's horse stumbled as it approached Catherine's fence line. The woman tumbled from her saddle, rolling several times before coming to rest in the tall grass. Her pursuers were less than 100 yards behind now, and Catherine could see they were rough-looking white men, probably deserters or outlaws taking advantage of the tensions between settlers and tribes. Catherine's voice rang out across the prairie, clear and commanding. "That's far enough," she shouted, leveling her Winchester at the lead rider. The men reined their horses to a halt, clearly surprised to find armed resistance. Their leader, a scarred man with a filthy beard, sneered at her. "This ain't your business, woman. That's a savage we're after, and we aim to catch her." The wounded woman was trying to crawl toward Catherine's cabin, leaving a dark trail in the grass. Without taking her eyes or rifle off the men, Catherine called out, "She's on my property now. You boys turn around and ride out, or I'll drop the first man who moves forward." The steel in her voice left no room for doubt. She meant every word. The standoff stretched for several long moments as the men assessed their situation. Catherine's finger rested steady on the trigger, her aim unwavering despite her racing heart. Finally, the leader spat and yanked his horse's head around. "Ain't worth dying over one squaw," he growled. "But you watch yourself, woman. Helping Indians ain't looked on kindly these days." Only when the riders had disappeared into the gathering darkness did Catherine lower her rifle and rush to the injured woman's side. Blood soaked the woman's deerskin dress, but she was conscious, her dark eyes reflecting both pain and fierce determination. "I am Night Sky," she managed to whisper in halting English. "Wife of White Eagle, chief of Pawnee. Those men attacked our hunting party." Catherine's decision to help had been instinctive, but as she helped Night Sky into her cabin, she realized she had just stepped into something far larger than herself. The woman's identity meant this incident would have repercussions beyond a simple act of mercy. As she began cleaning and bandaging Night Sky's wounds, Catherine could only pray she had made the right choice. The night stretched long as Catherine tended to her unexpected guest. Night Sky had taken a bullet to her shoulder, But Catherine's years of treating injured livestock had given her skilled hands for such work. As she extracted the bullet and stitched the wound, Night Sky remained stoic, speaking only to thank her helper in a mixture of English and Pawnee words. Just before dawn, Catherine heard hoofbeats approaching her cabin. Her heart raced as she peered through a gap in the curtains to see a group of riders materializing from the misty plains. Unlike the rough men who had attacked Night Sky, these warriors sat tall and proud on their horses, their faces painted with ceremonial markings. At their head rode a commanding figure she assumed must be White Eagle himself, his feathered headdress catching the first rays of morning light. Catherine stepped onto her porch, hands raised to show she meant no harm. Night Sky had warned her that her people would come searching, having tracked the blood trail from the attack site. The Pawnee chief dismounted with fluid grace, his stern expression softening slightly when Night Sky appeared in the doorway behind Catherine, wounded but alive. The reunion between husband and wife was dignified but deeply touching, their fingers intertwining briefly before White Eagle turned to address Catherine. "You have saved my heart," he said in clear English, surprising Catherine. The Pawnee do not forget such debts. He gestured to one of his warriors, who brought forward a beautifully tooled leather bundle. Inside were exquisite furs and beadwork that would fetch a small fortune in Abilene's trading posts. But more valuable was the carved wooden token he pressed into her palm, a symbol of protection and free passage among all allied tribes. The sound of more riders drew their attention. Catherine recognized Thomas, the local rancher who served as unofficial lawman for their scattered community of homesteads. He reined his horse to a stop, taking in the scene with obvious concern. "Everything all right here, Miss Catherine?" he called out, his hand resting near his holstered pistol. Several other armed settlers had followed him, creating a tense tableau. "Stand down, Thomas," Catherine said firmly, stepping between the two groups. "These are friends." She explained what had happened, watching the settlers' expressions shift from suspicion to grudging respect. White Eagle listened intently, then spoke to Thomas directly about the renegade attackers who had wounded his wife. An alliance was forming before Catherine's eyes, born from a simple act of mercy in the night. Over the next few hours, as the morning sun climbed higher, Catherine's cabin became an unlikely meeting ground. White Eagle described the gang that had been raiding both settler and native hunting parties along the Kansas border. Thomas sent riders to alert neighboring ranches and the sheriff in Fort Worth. Maps were drawn in the dirt, territories discussed, arrangements made for joint patrols to protect everyone's interests. Night Sky rested inside while the men talked, but her quiet presence was a reminder of what had brought them together. Catherine brought coffee and cornbread to the gathered leaders, marveling at how quickly the world could change. Yesterday, she had been a lonely widow trying to keep her small cattle operation afloat. Today, she was at the center of an unprecedented cooperation between peoples who had viewed each other with suspicion for generations. As the Pawnee prepared to depart with their recovered chief's wife, White Eagle made a final proclamation. Any trader bearing Catherine's token would have safe passage through Pawnee lands, and his people would help guard the settlers' cattle from rustlers. In return, the settlers would respect tribal hunting grounds and help track down the outlaw gang. Thomas agreed readily, seeing the advantages for everyone. Catherine found herself designated as the unofficial liaison between the two communities, a role she hadn't sought but felt honored to accept. The dust from departing horses had barely settled when Emma, Catherine's nearest neighbor, came rushing up in her wagon. She had heard fragments of news from passing riders and could hardly believe the tales. Catherine invited her in for tea, knowing the story would spread quickly across the prairie. As she described the night's events, she fingered the carved token in her pocket and wondered what other changes this new alliance would bring to their harsh but beautiful corner of the plains. Sarah Miller wiped the sweat from her brow as she surveyed the vast expanse of prairie grass surrounding her homestead on the outskirts of Abilene. The late summer heat shimmered across the plains, making the distant cattle herds appear to dance like mirages. Her decision to establish a trading post here had raised eyebrows among the townspeople, but the strategic location between the major cattle trails and Native American hunting grounds was too valuable to ignore. The sound of hoofbeats drew her attention to the eastern horizon, where a lone rider approached at a steady gallop. It was Jake Thompson, one of the few ranch hands who'd maintained friendly relations with both settlers and tribes. His usually cheerful face bore an expression of grave concern as he dismounted near her porch, his horse's flanks dark with sweat from the hard ride. Miss Miller, there's trouble brewing. A group of cattle rustlers hit the Wilson spread last night, and they're trying to blame it on the Pawnee. William Davis is gathering men in town, talking about riding out to the winter camp. Jake's words carried the weight of impending conflict, something Sarah had worked tirelessly to prevent since establishing her trading post 3 seasons ago. Sarah's mind raced to the Pawnee chief's wife, Catherine Morning Star, whom she'd found gravely wounded by a mountain lion last winter. The week spent nursing her back to health had forged an unlikely friendship and opened doors to peaceful trade with multiple tribes. Now that delicate balance teetered on the edge of destruction because of someone's greed and malice. Inside her trading post, Sarah quickly gathered medical supplies and trade goods, knowing she'd need both for what was to come. The shelves, stocked with everything from calico fabric to brass kettles, represented more than just commerce. They were physical proof that cooperation between peoples was possible. She couldn't let violence destroy what had taken so long to build. Jake, ride to Thomas Johnson's ranch and tell him what's happening. He's got influence with the cattlemen, and we'll need level heads if we're going to prevent bloodshed. Sarah secured her saddlebags while explaining her plan. I'm heading to the Pawnee camp to warn them and hear their side. Someone's trying to spark a war, and I aim to find out who. The prairie wind carried the scent of sage as Sarah rode north, her mind churning with possibilities. The rustlers had chosen their timing well. Many of the younger Pawnee warriors were away on a buffalo hunt, leaving the winter camp vulnerable. The missing cattle had to be somewhere close, hidden in one of the countless draws and valleys that carved through the grasslands. James Miller, her younger brother and the only family she had left, caught up with her an hour into her ride. Saw the dust from your trail and figured you'd be heading this way, he said, falling in beside her. Elizabeth Thompson sent word. She overheard some strangers at the saloon last night, planning something big. Said they needed a distraction to pull it off. The pieces began falling into place in Sarah's mind. The cattle theft wasn't about the livestock at all. It was meant to draw attention away from something else. But what could be valuable enough to risk inciting a war? The answer hit her like a thunderbolt. The army payroll was due through Abilene, and with most men either out on the range or preparing to confront the Pawnee, the town would be practically undefended. They crested a rise to find Samuel Wilson waiting for them, his face grim. As one of the few settlers who regularly traded with the tribes, he shared Sarah's concern for maintaining peace. Found tracks leading west toward the old McCullough silver mine. Too many for Pawnee. They're using shod horses, and the sign shows they're driving those cattle hard, not trying to hide their trail. It's too obvious. Sarah reined her horse around to face both men. We need to split up. James, ride back to Abilene and warn Mary Davis at the telegraph office. She needs to alert Fort Worth about the payroll. Samuel, find Jake and Thomas. Tell them to gather men they trust and watch the approaches to town. I'm still heading to the Pawnee camp. We'll need their scouts if we're going to unravel this in time. The sun had passed its zenith when Sarah finally spotted the smoke from the Pawnee winter camp. Her heart sank as she saw warriors preparing for battle, their faces painted with ochre and black stripes. Catherine Morningstar emerged from her lodge as Sarah approached, her dark eyes filled with worry, but also trust. The friendship forged through healing would now be tested by the threat of violence. Catherine Morningstar's weathered face showed recognition of the gravity in Sarah's expression. The raiders you track, they are not our people, she stated firmly in careful English, motioning Sarah to dismount. Many strange riders have passed through our hunting grounds these past days. My husband's scouts watch them from the shadows of the cottonwoods. Sarah gratefully accepted the offered water skin, taking a measured drink before explaining the situation. The afternoon wind rustled through the teepees, carrying the scent of sage and wood smoke. Your scouts are right to be cautious. These men are driving stolen cattle toward the old silver mine, and I believe they're planning something worse. There's an army payroll wagon coming through from Fort Worth. The chief's wife nodded slowly, her dark eyes reflecting the complexity of their shared predicament. Our warriors prepare not for you or your town, but because we too see the storm gathering, the spirits whisper of blood on the grass. She gestured to a young brave who stood nearby. Running Fox will show you what we found. The warrior led Sarah to the edge of the camp where, partially hidden beneath a buffalo robe, lay the body of a white man. His clothes were trail-worn but of good quality, and a distinctive silver watch chain glinted at his vest. Sarah's breath caught. She recognized the timepiece as one William had admired in Silver City just 2 months prior. He carried this, Catherine said, presenting a crumpled letter. The paper bore a Silver City bank letterhead, confirming Sarah's growing suspicions. This wasn't just about cattle rustling. Someone was orchestrating a much larger scheme, using the tensions between settlers and tribes as cover for their true intentions. Back in Abilene, James burst into the telegraph office, startling Mary Davis from her ledger work. The normally composed operator's eyes widened as he gasped out Sarah's warning. Her fingers flew across the key, sending urgent messages not only to Fort Worth but to Silver City as well. The web of conspiracy was spreading wider than anyone had initially suspected. Meanwhile, Samuel found Jake and Thomas at the Lucky Strike Saloon, where the afternoon crowd had thinned to a few dedicated drinkers. The men huddled in serious conversation, their usual good-natured banter replaced by grim determination as they planned their strategy. They knew every approach to town, every draw and wash where ambushers might hide. The sun was dropping toward the horizon when Sarah finally rode back into Abilene, accompanied by 2 Pawnee scouts who moved like shadows through the growing dusk. The town had taken on a different character. Windows were shuttered, women hurried children indoors, and armed men took up discreet positions on rooftops and in doorways. Elizabeth met Sarah at the livery stable, her face tight with worry as she helped tend to the tired horse. "Emma's seen strange riders watching the town from the North Ridge," she whispered, glancing nervously at the gathering darkness. "And Thomas says the Miller place was hit. They took every horse in the corral." Sarah's mind raced, connecting the pieces of this deadly puzzle. The raiders weren't just planning to ambush the payroll wagon. They were systematically gathering the horseflesh they'd need for a lightning-fast raid and escape. With both Indian warriors and townspeople on edge, one spark could ignite a bloody conflict that would serve as perfect cover for the real criminals. The night settled over Abilene like a wool blanket, thick and oppressive. In Catherine Morningstar's camp, warriors maintained their vigilance while in town. Sarah and her allies prepared for whatever dawn might bring. The old alliances would be tested, trust stretched to its limits. And somewhere in the darkness, their enemies were drawing ever closer to springing their trap. As midnight approached, Sarah stood at her cabin window, watching the intermittent flashes of heat lightning illuminate the prairie. The distant rumble of thunder matched her unease as she considered their predicament. 2 Pawnee scouts had arrived at Catherine Morningstar's camp with troubling news. The horse thieves weren't working alone. They'd spotted men in army uniforms moving through the tall grass. But something about their behavior seemed wrong. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. These weren't real soldiers. They were raiders using stolen uniforms to sow confusion and distrust between the townspeople and their Indian allies. If violence erupted between settlers and tribes, no one would look too closely at missing army payroll or vanished horses. She needed to warn both sides before it was too late. Through the darkness, Sarah made her way to Thomas's livery stable, where a small group had gathered. Emma sat nervously twisting her apron while William cleaned his rifle by lamplight. Jake paced the wooden floor, his spurs making a rhythmic clicking that set everyone's teeth on edge. They all knew that tomorrow's army payroll delivery could turn into a bloodbath if they couldn't prevent it. "The raiders want us fighting each other," Sarah explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're counting on old prejudices and fear to blind us to their real plan." She laid out what she'd learned from Catherine's scouts, watching understanding dawn in her companion's eyes. The truth of it was clear. They needed to unite both communities before sunrise or risk losing everything they'd built. Elizabeth arrived with news from the telegraph office. The Army patrol escorting the payroll had camped 10 miles out, planning to arrive mid-morning. Sarah Miller stood atop the wooden watchtower, her keen eyes scanning the vast prairie surrounding Fort Worth as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the grasslands. 2 weeks had passed since she'd saved Swift Deer, the Pawnee chief's wife, from a rattlesnake bite using her grandmother's herbal remedies. The alliance formed through that act of kindness had brought unprecedented peace to the region, but today, something felt different in the air. William Thompson, the ranch foreman, climbed up to join her, his weathered face creased with concern. "Dust clouds to the northwest," he reported, pointing toward a distant smudge on the horizon. "Too organized to be wild cattle. Could be those renegade raiders we heard about from the trading post." Sarah's fingers tightened on her father's old spyglass as she studied the approaching movement. Catherine Davis burst into the tower, her usually composed demeanor shaken. 3 Pawnee riders just came in. They say a band of deserters from the cavalry is heading this way, burning everything in their path. They've already hit 2 smaller settlements. The news sent a chill through Sarah, knowing Fort Worth's newly established peace hung by a thread. The town council gathered quickly in James Wilson's general store, their voices echoing off the wooden walls as they debated their options. Elizabeth Johnson, the schoolteacher, had been keeping detailed records of the regional tribes' movements and alliances. "If those raiders drive a wedge between us and the Pawnee, we'll lose everything we've built here," she warned, spreading her maps across the counter. Sarah's mind raced back to the promise she'd made to Swift Deer, that their peoples would protect each other. She stood suddenly, silencing the arguing council members. "Send riders to the Pawnee camps," she declared, "not to ask for help, but to warn them. Show them we honor our word." Thomas Miller, her younger brother, volunteered immediately to make the dangerous ride. As dusk approached, Jake Davis organized the townspeople into defensive positions. The cattle ranchers brought their herds closer to town, using the animals as a natural barrier. Women and children were gathered in the stone church, while every able-bodied adult was armed and assigned a post. Sarah worked tirelessly, distributing her healing supplies among makeshift aid stations. The first attack came just after midnight, a probing raid that tested their defenses. The raiders, led by a man they called Samuel the Ghost Thompson, were shocked to find not just settlers but Pawnee warriors defending the town's perimeter. Swift Deer herself had brought nearly 100 mounted braves, their arrival transforming Fort Worth's defense into an impregnable fortress. Dawn revealed the raiders' main force massing for a larger assault. Sarah watched from her position in the church bell tower as Swift Deer approached under a flag of truce, facing Samuel Thompson's gang. The Pawnee chief's wife spoke in both English and her native tongue, her words carrying across the morning air. "This town and these people are under our protection. The next man who raises a weapon against them will face the combined might of all the Plains tribes." The raiders' ranks began to waver as more native riders appeared on the surrounding hills. Not just Pawnee now, but representatives from other tribes who had heard of Sarah's deed and the alliance it had forged. Samuel Thompson's attempt to intimidate the town had inadvertently demonstrated the strength of the new peace, as tribes that had once been enemies now stood together to defend Fort Worth. The final confrontation came not with gunfire but with a choice. Samuel Thompson, seeing his men's resolve crumbling, faced a decision that would echo through the territory's history. Sarah watched as the outlaw leader slowly dismounted, removed his gun belt, and approached Swift Deer with open hands. The gesture spoke louder than words. The raiders would leave, and the story of Fort Worth's unusual alliance would spread across the frontier. As the dust settled and the celebrating began, Sarah found herself sitting with Swift Deer in the shade of the general store's porch. "Your medicine saved more than my life," the Pawnee woman said softly. "It planted a seed of trust that has grown into something our children will remember." Together they watched as townspeople and tribal members mingled freely in the street, trading goods and stories, their shared victory creating bonds stronger than any treaty. The events of that day transformed Fort Worth into something unprecedented, a true meeting place between cultures. Sarah's simple act of kindness had bloomed into an alliance that would reshape the territory's future. As night fell, the combined feast of settlers and tribes beneath the stars proved that the frontier's greatest strength lay not in weapons or walls, but in the courage to trust and protect one another. The morning after the celebration brought new challenges as word spread of Fort Worth's unprecedented alliance. Riders from distant settlements arrived daily, some bearing skepticism, others hope. Sarah found herself acting as an informal ambassador between worlds, her medical knowledge now bridging gaps far beyond mere physical healing. The trading post she'd established behind her clinic became a model for others, as tribal members brought rare herbs and knowledge that revolutionized her practice. Swift Deer's influence among the Pawnee grew stronger, her survival and subsequent alliance with the settlers earning her a respected voice in tribal councils. She taught Sarah the intricate meanings behind tribal medicine rituals while learning modern medical techniques in return. Their partnership sparked something larger than either had imagined, a fusion of healing traditions that drew people from hundreds of miles around. The cattle drives passing through Fort Worth now found safe passage through tribal lands, with Pawnee scouts often riding alongside the cowboys to ensure mutual protection. James, the seasoned trail boss who'd initially doubted Sarah's methods, became one of the strongest advocates for the new arrangement. His crews reported higher success rates and fewer losses when working with their tribal partners. In the town itself, the changes were profound, but not without growing pains. Some older settlers, including Thomas at the general store, initially resisted the increased tribal presence. But when Pawnee traders brought premium buffalo hides and rare medicines that doubled his profits, his opposition softened. The sound of native languages mixing with English in the streets became as common as the crack of wagon wheels on the hard-packed earth. Sarah expanded her clinic, adding a wing specifically for teaching both settler and tribal healing methods. Young Pawnee women trained alongside settler girls, each group learning to respect and incorporate the other's knowledge. The sight of Elizabeth, the banker's daughter, grinding herbs with 2 rivers, a young tribal healer, became a symbol of the town's transformation. When drought struck the territory that summer, the alliance faced its greatest test. Cattle began dying on both settler ranches and tribal grazing lands. Swift Deer's people shared their generations of knowledge about hidden water sources and drought-resistant plants, while the settlers' deep wells helped sustain both communities. Together, they moved herds to sheltered valleys that had been tribal secrets for centuries. Catherine, the schoolteacher, invited tribal elders to share their stories with her students, understanding that the future of their unique community depended on the children. Young minds, unburdened by old prejudices, absorbed both cultures naturally. They played games that mixed cowboys and Indians not as enemies, but as the partners they'd become in real life. The success of Fort Worth's experiment drew attention from territorial officials. When the governor's representatives arrived to investigate, they found something unprecedented: a thriving economy built on cooperation rather than conflict. Sarah and Swift Deer presented their case together, demonstrating how their combined medical knowledge had reduced deaths and improved life for everyone in the region. As autumn approached, bringing cooler winds across the plains, the town prepared for its first formal joint council. Tribal leaders would sit equally with town officials to discuss common concerns and plans for the future. Sarah, watching the preparations from her clinic porch, reflected on how far they'd come from that first desperate night when she'd chosen to help a wounded stranger. Emma, the young widow who'd recently arrived from Abilene, observed that Fort Worth had become something she'd never imagined possible on the frontier, a place where strength came from unity rather than separation. The town's example began inspiring others, as traders carried tales of its success to distant settlements. What had begun as one woman's act of compassion had grown into a model for a different kind of West, where the medicine of understanding proved more powerful than the gun. The joint council meeting was nearly derailed when a band of rogue raiders attacked a nearby cattle drive, threatening the delicate peace. Word reached Fort Worth just as tribal leaders were arriving, carried by a breathless young ranch hand who'd ridden through the night. Sarah immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. This could shatter everything they'd built if handled poorly. Rather than retreat to defensive positions as old instincts demanded, Sarah convinced both town officials and tribal representatives to face this crisis together. James, the Pawnee chief's most trusted warrior, joined William and a mixed group of townsmen and tribal hunters to track the raiders. This unprecedented cooperation sent ripples of uncertainty through some of the more traditional members of both communities. Emma, having lost her husband to similar violence, found herself serving as an unexpected voice of wisdom. She shared her story of grief and healing with the gathered leaders, demonstrating how vengeance only perpetuated cycles of bloodshed. Her words resonated deeply, especially with Catherine, who had initially opposed any alliance with the tribes after losing her father in earlier conflicts. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Abilene settlement as Sarah Miller stood on her porch, watching the unprecedented scene unfold before her. Hundreds of Pawnee warriors on horseback approached peacefully, led by Chief Running Bear and his now-recovered wife Morning Star. The sight brought tears to her eyes as she remembered the harrowing night 3 weeks ago when she had found the gravely wounded woman and made the choice that would forever change the relationship between settlers and tribes. William Thompson, the settlement's leader, emerged from his house looking both anxious and hopeful. The agreement they had negotiated through Sarah's remarkable connection with Morning Star would either secure lasting peace or fail spectacularly. Sarah had spent countless hours learning Pawnee words and customs while nursing the chief's wife back to health. forming a bond that transcended the deep mistrust between their peoples. The atmosphere in Abilene was electric as the warriors dismounted and approached on foot, their decorated horses creating a magnificent backdrop against the prairie grass. Sarah noticed how the settlers' initial fear had given way to cautious wonder. Even Thomas Davis, who had lost family to tribal raids years ago, stood watching with an expression of grudging respect rather than his usual bitterness. Morning Star walked ahead of her husband to embrace Sarah, an act that caused murmurs of amazement from both sides. The Pawnee woman's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. The arrow wound that had nearly claimed her life now fully healed, thanks to Sarah's knowledge of both frontier medicine and the healing plants Morning Star had taught her to use. Their shared experience had created something unprecedented, true understanding between two worlds. The formal ceremony began as Chief Running Bear and William Thompson met in the center of the settlement. Through Morning Star's translation, they spoke of the new trading agreement that would allow both peoples to prosper. The Pawnee would guide cattle drives safely through their territories, while the settlers would provide medical care and share their farming techniques. It was more than a treaty. It was a revolution in how the two communities could coexist. Catherine Wilson, the settlement's schoolteacher, watched in fascination as Morning Star began teaching the gathered children both Pawnee and English words. The woman's natural gift for bridging cultures was evident as young ones from both sides quickly began mimicking each other's languages, their laughter dissolving centuries of prejudice. Sarah felt her heart swell with pride at how far they had come from that desperate night. James Miller, Sarah's husband, stood beside Jake Johnson as they discussed the practical aspects of the new arrangement with several Pawnee hunters. The warriors were explaining their sophisticated methods of tracking cattle and predicting weather patterns, knowledge that would prove invaluable to the ranchers. The men's initial skepticism had given way to genuine respect for each other's expertise. Elizabeth Davis, who had originally opposed any cooperation with the tribes, now found herself deep in conversation with a group of Pawnee women about their different techniques for preserving food and tanning hides. The exchange of knowledge was flowing both ways, as the settlers learned that many of their assumptions about tribal life had been completely wrong. The women's practical wisdom would help both communities survive the harsh prairie winters. As the day progressed, Samuel Wilson organized a demonstration of the settlers' new irrigation system, showing how it could benefit both peoples during the dry seasons. The Pawnee engineers quickly grasped the concepts and began suggesting improvements based on their generations of experience with the land. This collaboration would later prove crucial in surviving one of the worst droughts in memory. The celebration that evening was unlike anything Abilene had ever seen. Traditional Pawnee dances merged with settler music, creating new rhythms that echoed across the prairie. Mary Johnson, the settlement's best cook, worked alongside Pawnee women to prepare a feast that combined both cultures' culinary traditions. The sharing of food became a powerful symbol of their new partnership. As night fell, Sarah sat with Morning Star near the communal fire, reflecting on how close they had come to missing this opportunity for peace. If she hadn't heard the wounded woman's cry that night, if she had chosen fear over compassion, none of this would have happened. Morning Star squeezed her hand, understanding the weight of that moment without words. The impact of their unprecedented alliance spread quickly across the frontier. Other settlements and tribes began sending representatives to Abilene, eager to learn how they had achieved what many thought impossible. Sarah and Morning Star found themselves becoming teachers, showing others how to build trust and understanding between different cultures. Their story became a beacon of hope in a time of change. The success of the trading agreement brought prosperity to both communities. The Pawnee's expertise in moving cattle through difficult terrain made Abilene's ranchers more successful than ever, while the tribe benefited from new medical knowledge and trading opportunities. More importantly, the children of both peoples were growing up without the burden of hatred and fear that had plagued previous generations. As the years passed, Sarah and Morning Star's friendship deepened into a bond that transcended their different backgrounds. They became symbols of what was possible when people chose understanding over fear. Their legacy lived on in the thriving community they had helped create, where settlers and Pawnee worked together to face the challenges of frontier life, proving that the greatest strength comes from unity rather than division. The story of how one woman's compassion changed the course of frontier history became legend, passed down through generations of both settlers and Pawnee. But for Sarah Miller, the real miracle was not in the grand agreements or historical significance. It was in the simple truth that love and understanding could bridge any divide if only people were brave enough to take the first step. The success of Sarah's alliance with the Pawnee soon drew attention from other settlements across the plains. Word spread to Abilene and Fort Worth of how one small community had achieved what many thought impossible. As spring turned to summer, traders and representatives from other towns began arriving to witness the cooperation firsthand and seek guidance on establishing their own peaceful relations with native tribes. Sarah found herself increasingly called upon to mediate disputes between settlers and various tribes, her reputation for fairness and wisdom extending far beyond the original agreement. Morning Star often accompanied her on these diplomatic missions, the two women's partnership a living testament to the possibility of mutual understanding. Their presence alone seemed to ease tensions and open minds to new possibilities. The cattle drives that once brought anxiety now became opportunities for commerce and cultural exchange. Pawnee scouts helped guide the herds through the safest routes, while settlers shared their medical knowledge and tools. Young William, Sarah's eldest son, learned the Pawnee language and became instrumental in facilitating these growing trade relationships. But peace always has its challengers. A group of rogue traders from Silver City, led by a bitter man named Thomas, attempted to undermine the alliance by spreading false rumors of betrayal on both sides. They saw the peaceful cooperation as a threat to their own profitable ventures in weapons and whiskey trading. Sarah and Morning Star worked tirelessly to maintain trust between their peoples. They organized gatherings where settlers and Pawnee could share meals, stories, and traditions. These events helped dispel the poisonous whispers before they could take root. Catherine, the local schoolteacher, began including Pawnee history and culture in her lessons, ensuring the next generation would grow up understanding and respecting their neighbors. The turning point came during a devastating drought that threatened both communities. Rather than competing for dwindling resources, the settlers and Pawnee pooled their knowledge. The Pawnee shared their understanding of native plants and hidden water sources, while the settlers contributed their irrigation techniques. Together, they survived what could have torn them apart. James, the town's blacksmith, worked with Pawnee craftsmen to develop new tools that combined the best of both worlds' technologies. Their innovations helped both communities become more efficient in their farming and hunting practices. The success of these collaborations inspired similar partnerships in other skills and trades. As autumn approached, Sarah received word that representatives from Fort Worth wanted to establish a formal trade agreement based on her model of cooperation. The town council, once skeptical of her original decision to help Morning Star, now unanimously supported expanding their peaceful alliance to include other settlements and tribes. The legacy of that fateful night when Sarah chose compassion over fear continued to ripple outward. Emma, her youngest daughter, grew up to become a respected diplomat herself, carrying forward her mother's work of building bridges between cultures. The trading post that had once been a source of tension became a symbol of unity, its walls adorned with both settler and Pawnee crafts. Looking back years later, Sarah would often sit with Morning Star on cool evenings, watching their grandchildren play together in the dusty street. They had created something precious and rare, not just peace, but genuine friendship between peoples. The plains that had once echoed with conflict now resonated with the sounds of shared laughter and cooperation. The story of Sarah Miller and Morning Star became more than just a tale of how trading rights were won. It became a lesson in the power of individual choices to shape history, of how one act of kindness could transform generations. In the end, the greatest trade they had made was not in goods or rights, but in the exchange of understanding and respect that had enriched both their peoples beyond measure.